When Rebecca Carter answered her phone late one night, the message she heard made her blood run cold. What began as a typical end to her grueling shift at the diner spiraled into something far more ominous. Secrets, half buried for years, resurfaced like ghosts. The frantic, whispered voice on the recording threatened to rip apart the fragile life she'd built for herself and her son. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of justice in the face of deception. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if you, like Rebecca, believe the truth should never remain hidden in the shadows, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories that shine a light on the darkest corners of our lives. Rebecca Carter lived in a two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Greenfield, a modest town edged by rolling farmland and dense woodlands. She had always found Greenfield's quiet charm appealing. The old library perched at the corner of Main Street, the antique store that smelled of lemon polish and time-worn leather, and the diner where she worked double shifts to make ends meet. She was a single mother, fiercely devoted to her 11-year-old son, Liam, who in many ways was her whole world. Liam's curiosity and quick wit reminded her daily that there was hope, even when life felt relentlessly difficult. At 33, Rebecca had become skilled at disguising her weariness behind a warm smile that she offered to both her customers and her child. But the strain beneath that smile was growing harder to hide. The night she received the fateful phone call, she was bone-tired. She had locked up the diner at midnight after her coworkers left. Greenfield didn't usually stir late into the night, and the streets were mostly empty by then. The fluorescent glow of the diner's sign flickered ominously against the dark sky. Though she normally felt some comfort in the routine, wiping down tables, counting tips, folding her apron, something about that evening left her on edge. There had been an odd customer who stared at her a little too long, someone with a vaguely familiar face who ordered nothing but coffee and asked if she'd always lived in Greenfield. The entire exchange unsettled her. By the time she stepped outside into the cool air, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, as though expecting to see a figure lurking. She tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to exhaustion. Once behind the wheel of her battered sedan, she relaxed slightly. The car had once been her ex-husband's. It was the one material thing she'd held onto after his alleged death in that terrible fire. The memory always gave her pause. She had never fully believed how cleanly the authorities wrapped up the investigation. But with no evidence to the contrary, she moved on for her son's sake. On the radio, a late-night host played a series of oldies that reminded her of quieter days. She turned the volume low to let the hum of the engine and her own thoughts fill the silence. When she pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex, her phone buzzed. It was nearly 1 a.m. She considered ignoring it. Maybe it was a telemarketer or a spam text, but something compelled her to check. The screen displayed a voicemail icon from Liam's number. A pang of guilt cut through her. Liam was supposed to be at Mrs. Boone's, her neighbor, for the night. Rebecca had left him there because she needed to pick up a late shift. It wasn't unusual for Liam to call, but he typically left cheerful messages about video games he was playing or jokes he wanted to share. Her lips curled into a faint smile, expecting to hear a playful quip. Instead, the voice that drifted through the speaker made her heart seize. "He found me," Liam whispered, breathless, the audio distorted by static. For words loaded with terror. Then, a faint click as the call ended. Rebecca's entire body tensed. She stood in the dim glow of the car's dome light, phone pressed to her ear, trying to glean more from that harrowing snippet. "He found me." Who was he? Her hands shook as she pressed redial, praying she would hear her son's voice. The call rang endlessly, then cut to an automated message. She dialed again, forcing her breathing to remain steady. No answer. Panic swarmed her thoughts. What was Liam doing out so late, unsupervised? Was Mrs. Boone okay? She fumbled for her keys, scrambled out of the car, and bolted upstairs to her apartment. If there was any chance Liam had come home, perhaps he was inside. Yet the apartment was dark and empty. She flicked on the lamps, calling his name. No response. Her next call was to the police station. An operator with a composed voice asked for details. Rebecca struggled to explain everything in a coherent manner: the cryptic voicemail, her ex-husband's suspicious past, the possibility that something was seriously wrong. The operator took notes and assured her that someone would be dispatched soon. But Rebecca couldn't just sit around, waiting. She locked her apartment and dashed to Mrs. Boone's unit 2 floors below. The door was ajar. Her heart hammered as she nudged it open. The living room lay in disarray, cushions scattered, a lamp knocked over, Mrs. Boone nowhere in sight. Liam was gone too. In the corner of the room, she spotted Liam's backpack. It was half unzipped, as though he had been rummaging for something and fled in a hurry. Rebecca crept farther inside, calling out, "Mrs. Boone? Liam?" Her voice echoed uncomfortably in the stillness. Then she saw the phone lying face down on the coffee table, a lock screen bearing Mrs. Boone's old-fashioned floral wallpaper. That phone might have been used to leave the voicemail. Footsteps on the threshold startled her. She spun around to see a uniformed officer in the doorway, pistol half raised in caution. Detective James Calloway arrived soon after, wearing a worn leather jacket and an air of gravitas. He apologized for the abrupt entrance, explaining that the operator had warned him of a possible abduction. He took in the scene with measured glances, no shattered glass or blood, just the signs of a quick struggle or a hurried escape. Rebecca tried to keep her composure as she described the situation to him. She emphasized that her ex-husband was presumed dead in a fire 7 years ago, but she had never seen his body. She admitted there had been hushed rumors he faked his death, but that was nothing more than local gossip, or so she had believed. Now, she wasn't sure of anything anymore. Calloway frowned, glancing around the overturned living room. In a calm, baritone voice, he said that the first step was to check security cameras in the complex and around town. He mentioned that, statistically, most missing children are found swiftly if they're runaways or if there's a family issue. Rebecca bristled at the word runaway. She insisted that Liam wouldn't run off. Then she paused, acknowledging that Liam might have gone willingly if he believed he was in danger from something else. Or someone else. A patrol officer began collecting details, snapping photos of the disarray. Another officer discovered that Mrs. Boone's car was missing from the parking lot. No one knew where she was. Rebecca's dread intensified. Had her neighbor been forced to drive Liam somewhere? Or was she complicit? Detective Calloway sent out a notice for Mrs. Boone's vehicle. Outside, the glow of street lamps cast an eerie halo over the scene as neighbors peeked from behind blinds, drawn by the commotion. Rebecca stood near the open door, arms crossed against a cool breeze. She felt unmoored, as though she had stepped into someone else's nightmare. Time crawled. The first rays of dawn found Rebecca on her couch, sleepless, her mind replaying that voicemail over and over. She kept second-guessing every detail. Could "he found me" refer to a stranger? Or was it specifically referencing her ex-husband? She tried to recall the events leading up to her ex-husband's supposed death. Their marriage had been rocky. Financial troubles, arguments about custody, his possible involvement in shady dealings. Her memory blurred under the stress. She had always felt uneasy about the way the fire investigation concluded. But once the police insisted it was an accident, once the remains were identified as his through partial dental records, she surrendered to the official narrative. She had been too exhausted to contest it. Now she regretted that deeply. Detective Calloway came by in the late morning to update her. He looked as though he'd been awake all night. His gray eyes flickered with sympathy. He explained that local surveillance footage showed a black SUV parked outside her building for about 10 minutes around midnight. The recording was too grainy to identify the driver. But at one point, a child matching Liam's description hopped into the passenger seat. He seemed agitated or frightened, though the camera angle was poor. They also spotted a second person, possibly older, lurking in the driver's seat. The SUV pulled away without headlights on, disappearing into the night. The partial plate number they had didn't match any immediate records in Greenfield. Detective Calloway rubbed the back of his neck, apologizing that they didn't have a solid lead yet. Rebecca was torn between despair and a flicker of hope. At least the video confirmed Liam was still alive at that point. But who owned the SUV? If the father was indeed alive, would he be so bold as to snatch his own son after all these years? Or could it be a relative, a friend, someone seeking revenge? The possibilities made her head spin. The intensity of the situation only grew when Rebecca received a cryptic text message on her phone that afternoon. It read, "You lied about who fathered him. The truth will come out." Her blood ran cold. She tried calling the number, but it was no longer in service. She showed the message to Calloway, who frowned deeply. "Could your ex-husband have believed Liam wasn't his?" the detective asked. "Or is there someone else who thinks Liam's not your ex-husband's child?" Rebecca recalled a fleeting rumor she had heard from a few acquaintances. People had whispered that Liam might not truly be her ex's biological son, given the timing of her pregnancy. She had dismissed those rumors, considering them malicious gossip from those who envied her or disliked her ex-husband's family. She insisted to Calloway, "Liam is absolutely his son. That rumor was nonsense." But the detective's gaze lingered on her, as though suspecting there might be more layers she wasn't sharing. She felt cornered, exposed. The fear that once drowned her was now joined by frustration. She had no idea who was behind these messages or what angle they were playing at. She just wanted her boy back. The day stretched into evening. Rebecca paced her living room, the blinds half-drawn, cell phone in hand, waiting for any word from the police or, better yet, from Liam. Helena, a close friend and nurse at the local clinic, arrived in a flurry of concern. She brought a casserole and unwavering moral support. Helena had known Rebecca since high school, long enough to have witnessed the messy unraveling of her marriage. She offered quiet comfort, occasionally glancing at her phone in case the police called with an update. Over the homey smell of warmed casserole, Helena asked, "Do you really think your ex could have survived that fire?" Rebecca shrugged, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't know. It would be the strangest thing, but I never saw his body, never got closure. Maybe he was desperate to escape something. Or maybe it's his brother. He had a twin, Andrew, who was estranged. I remember them barely speaking. That might be relevant." Helena's eyes widened. "You never mentioned he had a twin. That could definitely explain the confusion. Maybe Andrew's behind this." The conversation only fueled Rebecca's anxiety, but it also stirred a grim resolve. If the father was out there, or the twin, or someone else from that family, she had to face the possibility head-on. Hiding from it wouldn't bring Liam home. Night fell again, and still no trace of Liam or Mrs. Boone. Detective Calloway and his team scoured phone records, searching for pings from Liam's cell phone. But there was nothing beyond that final voicemail. The next morning, while Rebecca was slumped in an armchair, phone cradled between her hands, the device vibrated. She answered, pulse racing. On the other end came a low, disguised voice. "Meet me at the old railroad station by noon tomorrow. Bring the ring. No police." Then a click. Rebecca's hand shook so badly that she nearly dropped the phone. The ring? She vaguely remembered a family heirloom that had belonged to her ex-husband's grandmother. She had never personally seen it, but she'd heard it was rumored to be worth a decent sum. Did that ring still exist? Why would someone assume she had it? She tried to recall scattered conversations about an heirloom that disappeared years before her ex's death. The father had boasted about an ornate piece studded with rubies, something that was supposed to go to the oldest child. But as far as she knew, the father never gave it to anyone, and it vanished after the fire. Could these kidnappers be demanding a ring that she didn't even have? She immediately relayed the call to Detective Calloway, who listened intently, scribbling notes. "This is a clear ransom demand," he said. "But they asked specifically for a ring. That's peculiar." He suggested that she check any old boxes, attics, or storage units for signs of this ring. If the kidnappers believed she had it, perhaps there was some old record or letter in her possession that could help them locate it. The idea was daunting, so many dusty boxes in her grandparents' house, which she used mostly for storage after they passed. She hadn't gone through them in years. Nodding numbly, Rebecca set off with Helena to explore her grandparents' place, a modest old house on the edge of town, surrounded by a tangle of unkempt shrubs. She still had the key. The interior was stale and dark, the furniture draped in sheets to protect it from dust. They climbed creaking stairs to the attic, where boxes were piled haphazardly. The air smelled of mothballs and old paper. Helena coughed as she lifted a lid from one of the boxes. They rummaged for hours, Photo albums, receipts, old children's toys from when Rebecca was a girl. Nothing relevant. But near the bottom of a trunk, Rebecca discovered a tattered envelope addressed to her ex-husband. The return address was from Andrew Carter. Inside was a single letter accusing her ex of stealing the ring after their grandmother's funeral. The tone was venomous, promising retribution if it wasn't returned. Andrew had scrawled lines like, "You think you can keep it from me, but it's my birthright. I'm done being the forgotten twin." Helena read the letter over her shoulder, whistling softly. This Andrew guy definitely felt wronged. Maybe he thinks you inherited the ring or that your ex gave it to you or Liam. Rebecca's throat tightened. She had no clue where the ring was, let alone if it was still in the family. But the letter was dated 6 months before the fire. She also found a small note from her ex's father, referencing how he never wanted Andrew near the property again. "He threatened to burn the cabin down," it read. "Your brother needs help. He can't keep letting the ring poison his mind." They pressed on until Helena uncovered a dusty videotape with no label. Rebecca stared at it, vaguely recalling a night when her ex had videotaped a heated conversation with his father about the family's legacy. She hadn't cared to watch it back then. It had seemed personal and full of drama she wanted to avoid. Maybe it contained something about the ring. The problem was finding a VCR in this day and age. She remembered seeing one in the living room under a cabinet. Sure enough, after rummaging, they dug out an old TV VCR combo. They lugged it to a corner of the attic near an outlet, praying it still functioned. The screen crackled to life. The footage was grainy, showing the interior of the family's remote cabin. The father was seated in a wooden chair, glaring at the camera. He spoke about the ring as a cursed object, explaining that both twins felt entitled to it. The father looked haggard, complaining that Andrew had already threatened violence. The footage then showed the father leaning close, lowering his voice. "If Andrew doesn't back off, I'm going to hide it somewhere he can never find it. This ring has caused enough harm. We can't let it tear the family apart." Then the recording abruptly ended. There was no mention of exactly where he planned to hide it, only a cryptic reference that he might bury it, where it all began. Rebecca rewound the tape, watching it twice more in case she missed any detail. Where it all began could be the old hardware store her ex's grandfather once ran, or the orchard by the cabin, or some other place steeped in family history. She felt nauseated by the scope of what might be expected of her. Liam was missing, kidnapped by someone who believed she possessed a valuable ring that might have been hidden away or destroyed years ago. She and Helena returned to her apartment, exhausted. Detective Calloway was waiting, sifting through more police updates. He took note of the letter and the tape, his expression growing grim. "Andrew Carter is a strong suspect," he said, "especially if your ex truly died in that fire. Andrew may now believe you have the ring." Rebecca murmured that they had no real proof her ex was dead. The detective sighed, acknowledging that possibility. "Still," he said, "the immediate focus is to ensure Liam's safety." They discussed the phone call demanding a meeting at the old railway station. "We'll set up a covert operation," Calloway decided. "You'll go, but we'll have officers nearby." Rebecca shuddered at the thought, but she'd do anything to get Liam back. She insisted that the kidnappers said, "No police," but Calloway assured her they would remain hidden. That night, she slept fitfully, haunted by images of Liam lost in darkness, calling for her. Dawn arrived, pale light creeping through her blinds. She dressed in practical jeans and a warm jacket, her fingers trembling as she thought about the confrontation ahead. The old railway station was a crumbling relic from a time when Greenfield had a busier economy. Now it stood on the outskirts of town, overgrown with weeds. Detective Calloway arranged for 2 unmarked vehicles to discreetly stake out the perimeter. He instructed her to park near the entrance and wait for the kidnapper to approach. She carried a small bag that supposedly held the ring, though in reality, it was empty except for a piece of costume jewelry resembling a ruby. They hoped this ruse might buy them time. At noon sharp, Rebecca parked her car near the dilapidated station. The wind rustled through tall, dry grass, and a broken sign dangled overhead, squeaking softly. Her heart pounded so loudly that it drowned out nearly every other sound. She clutched the bag containing the fake ring, scanning the area for signs of movement. For several agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Then, a black SUV rumbled up, stopping about 50 yards away. The glare on the windshield prevented her from seeing the driver's face. She swallowed hard, stepping out of her car. The SUV door opened. A man emerged, tall and lean, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. He lifted his chin, revealing a face similar to the man she once married, yet not identical. Andrew, she guessed, though the features were so eerily close to her ex's that her breath caught. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he motioned for her to come closer. Rebecca glanced around, hoping the police were in position. She could see no sign of them, but she trusted Calloway's plan. When she drew near, Andrew's mouth curled into a sneer. "Where is it?" he demanded. His voice had an edge of desperation, reminding her uncomfortably of a cornered animal. She raised the small bag, voice trembling. "I have it here. But first, let me see Liam." Andrew's eyes narrowed. "Not until I confirm it's authentic." He snatched the bag from her hand. Rummaging inside, he pulled out the ring. A moment later, his expression darkened with suspicion. "This isn't it," he hissed. "You think you can fool me with a cheap imitation?" He hurled the ring onto the gravel. Her blood went cold. She had hoped he wouldn't be able to tell the difference immediately. Andrew advanced, one hand hidden inside his jacket. Rebecca feared a weapon. She stepped back, stammering, "I don't know where the real ring is. I swear." "Please, my son." Andrew's lips twisted. "Your son, or my brother's son? The truth is, we're going to find out. Because I'm tired of the lies. If you won't give me the ring, then perhaps your boy's father can step forward. Unless he's not who you claim." Just then, an engine roared from behind a thicket of trees. An unmarked police car raced forward, lights flashing. Andrew jolted, whipped out a gun, and aimed it at the ground near Rebecca's feet. She froze, heart lurching into her throat. A second police car emerged from the other side. Andrew realized he was surrounded. He leveled the gun at Detective Calloway, who had stepped out with his weapon drawn but pointed downward in a show of caution. For a tense moment, time seemed to slow. Andrew's eyes darted between them, calculating. Then he fired a wild shot into the air and sprinted back to the SUV, engine revving. Calloway shouted for him to stop, but Andrew slammed the door, tires screeching. He sped off, disappearing down a narrow service road. Rebecca stumbled backward, knees weak, tears stinging her eyes. In a swirl of confusion, the officers checked on her. Calloway cursed quietly, lamenting that Andrew got away. They at least had a better description of him now, possibly enough for a county-wide alert. But there had been no sign of Liam in the SUV. Where was he keeping her son? Back at the station, Calloway tried to console Rebecca. "We'll find him," he said gently. But she felt hollow. Andrew's final words echoed in her mind, "Unless he's not who you claim." Could Andrew truly believe that Liam wasn't fathered by her ex-husband? Or was this a twisted ploy to sow confusion? The next few days were a blur of police briefings, press conferences, and tearful pleas from Rebecca for Liam's safe return. Flyers with Liam's photo appeared all over town. The local news featured his story, urging anyone with information to come forward. Mrs. Boone's car turned up abandoned in a neighboring county, wiped clean of prints. No sign of Mrs. Boone herself. Then, out of nowhere, another phone call reached Rebecca's line in the middle of the night. She answered, breath tight in her chest. A child's voice whispered, "Mom?" She nearly collapsed with relief, pressing the phone to her ear. "Liam, are you okay?" Before he could respond, Andrew's harsh voice barked, "Move," and the call cut off. Rebecca fell into a sobbing heap on the floor, the phone still clutched in her hand. Yet hearing Liam's voice gave her hope that he was still alive. She recounted every syllable to Calloway. The detective speculated that Andrew might be forcing Liam to record messages to manipulate Rebecca further. The realization sickened her, but she refused to succumb to despair. On a hunch, Calloway decided to re-examine the official file on her ex-husband's death. He discovered significant inconsistencies. The coroner's report was incomplete, referencing that the remains recovered from the cabin fire were largely unidentifiable. The police back then had found a wallet with the father's ID near the scene, which formed the basis of the identification. But no conclusive DNA match was done. The detectives scoured statements from neighbors who claimed to see the father leaving town prior to the fire. None of it was definitive proof, but enough to cast doubt. Could Rebecca's ex-husband still be alive, orchestrating events, or had Andrew orchestrated the entire thing alone? Rebecca's nights became endless vigils by the phone. She was haunted by nightmares of flames devouring the cabin, of Liam crying out for help. Meanwhile, Helena visited frequently, sometimes cooking or cleaning to take the load off. Her friend also kept pressing, "Is there anything else about your ex you haven't told the police?" She forced Rebecca to recall arguments from the past. The biggest fight had been over money. Her ex wanted to invest in questionable ventures, she refused, and they'd parted ways. The father had threatened to take Liam away from her, claiming that with enough money and connections, he could win full custody. The memory sent a shiver through her. If he was alive, maybe he still wanted that control. The next break came when a local diner owner recognized Andrew from a photo the police circulated. The owner said Andrew had been in with a boy who looked afraid, but not physically harmed. They'd sat in a corner booth, speaking in hushed tones. Andrew paid in cash, left quickly. This was the first official sighting of Liam since his abduction. Calloway rushed to the diner with Rebecca to question the owner, who recalled that Andrew had scolded the boy for something, then muttered about heading up to the cabin. That phrase, the cabin, made Rebecca's heart leap. Could Andrew be hiding in that old family cabin deep in the woods, the same cabin that was supposedly destroyed by fire? Calloway organized a team to search the area. The father's old family cabin was about a 30-minute drive from Greenfield, nestled by a lake, surrounded by dense pine forest. Years ago, that was where the father had retreated to whenever life in town overwhelmed him. If the structure wasn't completely destroyed, Andrew might be using it or a secondary building on the property. The local maps indicated there was a smaller hunting cabin near the main house. Perhaps the fire had only consumed the main structure. Fueled by anxious determination, Rebecca insisted on going along with the search party, but Calloway said she should remain safely behind. Ultimately, they struck a compromise. She would wait at a command post near the trailhead, not directly at the site. They set out early the following morning, a convoy of police vehicles winding up the dirt road leading into the forest. The smell of damp earth and pine resin filled the crisp air. Rebecca could almost taste her fear, metallic on her tongue. She stood by an SUV with a small group of officers, anxiously watching as Calloway and a few others ventured deeper along a narrow path on foot. The plan was to approach quietly, scout the remains of the cabin, and see if Andrew was holed up there with Liam. For 2 hours she waited, the minutes crawling like hours. Finally, static crackled on the radio, and she heard Calloway's subdued voice. "We found a small cabin. Looks like someone's been here recently. Stand by." Her heart thudded wildly. 10 more minutes passed. Another crackle. "There's a basement. We see signs someone might be inside." A muffled shout in the background, then silence. Her entire body tensed with dread. She clenched her fists, resisting the urge to charge down the trail. Then a voice, "We've got the boy. He's safe." Relief crashed over her, tears spilling uncontrollably. She sank to her knees, sobbing in sheer gratitude. Liam was alive. She waited in a daze until the officers emerged, guiding Liam by the shoulder. He looked pale, eyes wide with exhaustion and fear, but unharmed. Rebecca ran to him, pulling him into a fierce hug. He buried his face in her jacket, trembling. She whispered reassurance, promising him it was over. But she noticed Andrew wasn't among the officers. Calloway, grim-faced, explained that Andrew had escaped out a back entrance. They were pursuing him, but at least they had Liam. Alone with her son, Rebecca stroked his hair, tears still flowing. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. "I should have protected you." Liam clung to her, voice quivering. "He said Dad might be alive. He kept saying weird stuff about how I needed to know the truth." She whispered that it was all lies, that none of it mattered now. But a nagging voice in her own mind reminded her that she hadn't definitively proven her ex was truly gone. All that mattered at the moment, though, was holding Liam safe in her arms. They took Liam to the local hospital for evaluation, though physically he seemed only lightly bruised. While Liam napped under a warm blanket, Detective Calloway updated Rebecca. "We found some files in that cabin. Letters, diaries. It seems Andrew believed his brother faked his death to avoid giving him the ring. The diaries also mention a deep resentment. Andrew felt overshadowed, denied his birthright. He said taking Liam was a way to force you or your ex-husband out into the open." Rebecca sank into a chair, absorbing the detective's words. "But do we have any proof my ex-husband is alive?" Calloway shook his head. "No concrete proof yet. Just Andrew's claims. He might have convinced himself that your ex is out there somewhere. The diaries reference meeting someone in the months leading up to the kidnapping, but the details are vague. It could be a figment of Andrew's imagination, or there really is a second person involved. We'll keep digging." Despite her relief, Rebecca sensed the story wasn't over. Andrew was still at large, presumably determined to locate that ring or flush out the father if he existed. That night, she stayed by Liam's hospital bed, drifting into an uneasy sleep. She dreamed of flickering firelight, shadows that resembled the father's face and the father's twin merging into one, chasing her through a labyrinth of corridors. The next morning, Liam stirred, blinking against the bright overhead lights. Rebecca gently asked him about his ordeal. He recounted how Andrew and Mrs. Boone were arguing while driving him away. Apparently, Mrs. Boone had been coerced at gunpoint, forced to drive her car until they swapped to the SUV. Andrew kept ranting about secrets, about how someone would pay for what they had done. Then they arrived at the cabin, where Mrs. Boone was locked in a separate room. Liam seldom saw her after that. Andrew was fixated on him, demanding to know if he had the ring or if your mother gave it to you. The boy was confused, terrified. He said Andrew sometimes mumbled about the father still being alive, wandering the country under a false name. Rebecca's heart broke listening to Liam's account. "Did Andrew ever mention where Dad might be?" she asked softly. Liam shrugged, eyes haunted. "He said something about Dad living off the grid, but he never said exactly where. He was so angry. He acted like Dad betrayed him." Detective Calloway arrived with more news. A phone ping suggested Andrew might have traveled 2 counties over, near some farmland that belonged to the Carter family years ago. The police would coordinate with local departments to try to track him down. In the meantime, they arranged protective detail for Rebecca and Liam. The hospital staff allowed them to remain in a secure wing for a day or two until they could be sure Andrew wouldn't attempt to snatch Liam again. Yet that afternoon, Rebecca received another cryptic text from a new number. "He's lying to you. The father is out there. You owe Liam the truth." She showed it to the detective, who sighed heavily. "It never ends." He tried to trace the number, but it was an unregistered burner phone again. The swirling questions and half-truths weighed on her. She decided, with Liam safe and resting, she would confront the one place she had avoided all these years, the burnt remains of the father's original cabin. Perhaps something was left behind, some clue to the ring's location or a final piece of evidence about his fate. She informed Calloway, who agreed to go with her. They left Liam under the watch of a trusted officer and drove out to the site in the detective's car. The road was rough, canopied by tall pines that formed a tunnel of green above them. Eventually, they reached a clearing. Charred timbers and collapsed beams greeted them, relics of a fire that had apparently consumed most of the structure. Weeds and wildflowers sprouted amidst the wreckage. The air smelled faintly of old ash, even years later. Rebecca felt a lump in her throat. This place was once a getaway for romantic weekends early in their marriage. Now it was a ruin, the site where the father allegedly died. Calloway produced a flashlight, despite the daytime sun. They moved carefully through the debris. Broken glass crunched underfoot. A few scorched remains of furniture lay scattered, half buried in dirt. Rebecca had rarely visited after the fire, always finding it too painful. But now she examined every corner, searching for anything that might prove the father's presence or confirm his death. Near the back of the property, she spotted a battered door leading to what might have been a root cellar. It was partially collapsed. Calloway used a crowbar from his trunk to pry it open. Beneath, they discovered a cramped space with stone walls. Inside, old storage shelves had partially survived the fire, blackened but intact. A few metal containers and dusty mason jars were lined up, their labels long faded. Rebecca noticed a wooden box tucked in the corner, its lid warped by heat. She gingerly approached, her heart hammering. When Calloway pried it open, they found nothing but a handful of charred papers, some too far gone to read. One partially legible page mentioned the ring. Should anything happen, hide it well. Andrew must never. The rest was unreadable. She sighed in frustration. Another dead end. Yet she found something else. An envelope containing a small photograph of her ex-husband standing next to a man who looked almost identical. The Wins. Written on the back was a date, roughly 4 months before the fire, and a note that read, "We'll settle this once and for all. Enough secrets." Calloway tapped the photograph. They clearly had some confrontation or agreement around that time. He rummaged deeper in the box but found no more clues about the ring's final resting place. They emerged from the cellar, the afternoon sun glaring. Rebecca exhaled heavily, feeling that the father was indeed behind some part of this or at least intimately involved before his supposed death. She thanked the detective for his help. He offered a small, comforting smile. "We'll keep at it," he said. Returning to the hospital, Rebecca discovered that Liam had awakened from a nap, the protective detail still outside his door. He greeted her with a tired smile. She perched on the edge of his bed and gently asked if he remembered anything else Andrew might have said. Liam furrowed his brow. "He mentioned a storage unit once," the boy recalled. "Something about Dad having a storage unit for important stuff. Andrew was mad because he thought Dad might have stashed the ring there. He even said, 'I tore that place apart, but I'll find it eventually.'" Rebecca latched onto the detail. Her ex-husband did, in fact, rent a small storage unit on the outskirts of Greenfield for a brief time. He once said it was to store some old supplies from his father's hardware store. She had nearly forgotten about it. If Andrew had already searched it, maybe nothing remained. But she decided it was worth checking, especially now that Liam confirmed Andrew had an interest in it. She told Calloway, who arranged to meet the storage facility manager early the next day. They arrived just after sunrise. The manager was a plump woman with a kind face. She recognized Rebecca from years ago. After some back and forth, the manager located the old lease for Unit B12. She handed over the key, explaining that the rent had been prepaid for a year but no one renewed after that. The unit likely sat unopened for quite some time. If Andrew had broken in, perhaps the lock was replaced, but they would see. B12 was near the far corner of the row of corrugated doors. Rust spots stained the metal. Calloway carefully turned the key. The door screeched upward, revealing a dusty interior with scattered boxes and a few pieces of old furniture. Rebecca's heart quickened. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of neglected cardboard. Andrew might have rifled through it, or perhaps never found it. She took a few cautious steps inside, flicking on a flashlight. The detective followed, stepping around piles of junk. They spent an hour combing through the unit, occasionally coughing from the dust. Most of the items were worthless or mundane: old receipts from the hardware store, rusted tools. Then, near the back, Rebecca opened a battered trunk. Inside was a cloth-wrapped bundle. She peeled back the layers, revealing a small, intricately carved wooden box. Her pulse hammered. She lifted the lid. Nestled inside was a ring, glittering even in the dim light. A band of gold, set with a cluster of small rubies around a central stone. She inhaled sharply. It had to be the ring. Calloway gazed at it with cautious reverence. "That's an antique," he murmured, snapping a few photos with his phone. Rebecca's hand shook as she lifted the ring. It felt oddly cold, as though carrying the weight of the family's dark history. She suddenly understood how something so small could drive a wedge between the father and Andrew. With Andrew's obsession, it was no wonder he believed she must have had it. She realized if Andrew discovered she'd actually found it, he might do anything to get it. Calloway suggested they turn it over to the police as evidence, to keep it safe. Rebecca hesitated, remembering Andrew's threats. Part of her wanted to use it as bait to finally lure Andrew out. But Calloway insisted that placing it in evidence was the surest way to keep it secure. "We'll figure out how to proceed from there," he said gently. She finally relented, slipping it into a small evidence bag the detective had brought along. Once the trunk was thoroughly checked, they left the storage facility. Rebecca half expected Andrew to appear in the parking lot, fuming with rage. But no one emerged. That afternoon, she visited Liam at the hospital again. He was improving, mentally and physically. She carefully explained that they'd found the ring, that Andrew was definitely after it, and that the police would keep it safe. Liam nodded but looked unsettled. "Mom, do you think Dad's alive?" Andrew kept saying he was. Rebecca sighed, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I don't know, sweetheart. I truly don't. For a long time, I believed he was gone. But this has all muddied the waters. If your father is alive, I imagine he'd have come for you by now. Or maybe he has a reason to stay hidden. The important thing is that you're safe." Liam studied her face as though searching for reassurance. Andrew said Dad ran away because he was guilty. Guilty about what? She blinked away tears. He had secrets, that much is clear. But secrets have a way of coming to light, no matter how hard we try to bury them. A day later, news came that the police had tracked Andrew to a remote cabin on farmland once owned by the Carter family. The local authorities formed a plan to approach quietly, wanting to avoid a violent confrontation. They wanted Rebecca to stay away, urging her to keep Liam safe. She reluctantly agreed, though her nerves frayed at the thought of Andrew cornered and desperate. She feared for any officer's safety who confronted him. But more than that, she feared Andrew might slip away again. Late that evening, Detective Calloway returned with a grim expression. The farmland cabin was empty. Andrew had fled, leaving behind a meager campsite. He appeared to be living off the land, evading pursuit. They found references to a final plan scrawled on scraps of paper, though the details were vague. One note read, "The ring is out there. I must have it. Then he'll have to come forward." Another said, "If the boy and Rebecca won't reveal his location, I'll force it out of them." The chilling words underscored that Andrew remained a danger, obsessed and unbalanced. In the midst of this tension, a surprising phone call arrived for Detective Calloway at the station. A man's voice, distorted by static, claimed to be the father. "Tell Rebecca and Liam I'm sorry," he said cryptically before the call dropped. Tracing the number led nowhere. But the call's existence fueled speculation that the father might indeed be alive, watching events unfold from afar, too afraid or unwilling to step out of the shadows. When Calloway informed Rebecca, she stared at him in disbelief. "He's alive?" she whispered, voice cracking. "Why hasn't he come to see Liam?" Calloway shook his head. "I wish I knew. Perhaps he fears Andrew, or the consequences of faking his death. He could also be implicated in insurance fraud if the fire was staged." The detective also raised the possibility that the caller was a fraud trying to sow more confusion. They had no proof it was truly him. The swirl of questions seemed unending. Eventually, Liam was released from the hospital. Rebecca brought him home, though an officer stood guard in a patrol car outside her apartment building. She tried to re-establish a sense of normalcy. She cooked his favorite meals, let him choose the TV shows they watched, tried to coax him into talking about school. But Liam was withdrawn, traumatized. He shivered at small noises, especially if they resembled footsteps outside. Sometimes she'd find him curled up on the couch, clutching a stuffed animal from his childhood. It shattered her heart. She vowed that Andrew would never lay a hand on him again. One quiet evening, while Liam slept, Rebecca lay awake, her thoughts spiraling. She couldn't erase the image of Andrew's glare or the memory of her ex-husband's lies. She realized she had to become more proactive. The ring was in police evidence, but Andrew was still out there. She decided to rummage through every old letter, document, anything that might provide a clue to the father's whereabouts. If she could find him first, maybe he'd testify about the ring, or he'd help end Andrew's vendetta. She spent hours going through old boxes in her bedroom closet, scanning each page carefully. Around midnight, she discovered a faded envelope from her ex-husband addressed to a P.O. box in another state. The date was after the official date of his death. That made her blood run cold. The postmark suggested he sent it 2 weeks after the fire. She tore the envelope open. Inside was a short letter, cryptic in nature, referencing a plan to rebuild life under a new name. Her ex wrote that he'd settle the score with Andrew eventually. The recipient of the letter was unclear. He only addressed it to her mind whirled. She took the letter to Detective Calloway the next morning, heart racing. He was stunned. "This is huge," he murmured. "If authentic, it's proof your ex survived. We need to see if we can track this P.O. box." The detective launched an inquiry with the Postal Service, but it was a small out-of-state office, and the box had closed years ago. The identity of was unknown. Still, it was a lead that might draw her ex-husband out or confirm once and for all he was alive. Meanwhile, Andrew's sightings became sporadic. A few towns over, a store clerk claimed he saw a man matching Andrew's description buying canned food. Another said he might have asked about local cabins for rent. Each tip led the police on a chase, always a few steps behind. Rebecca tried to maintain some semblance of stability for Liam, who returned to school part-time with a counselor's support. Classmates whispered about his disappearance, and teachers offered sympathetic smiles. At home, the protective detail had eased, but an officer still swung by regularly. Rebecca felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination, knowing that they were in the eye of the storm, that Andrew was likely planning his next move. One afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor, a gaunt woman in her 50s, standing at her door with timid eyes. It was Mrs. Boone. She looked disheveled, as though she had been through an ordeal. Rebecca rushed her inside, calling for Helena, who had just arrived for a visit. Mrs. Boone trembled, explaining that Andrew had threatened her life, forcing her to help lure Liam away that night. He'd kept her captive for days in a locked room at the cabin. She eventually escaped when Andrew left to gather supplies. She had wandered through the forest until a passing motorist helped her get back to town. Tears streamed down Mrs. Boone's cheeks as she apologized profusely, claiming she never meant for Liam to be hurt. She was too terrified to defy Andrew. Rebecca's initial anger softened into pity. She phoned Detective Calloway, who arrived to debrief Mrs. Boone. The traumatized neighbor recounted details of Andrew's rants, how he harbored a deep hatred for his brother, how he believed the father owed him the ring and an apology. She also heard him muttering about forcing a big reveal, something about a meeting with the father himself. But Andrew never gave specifics. She did mention that Andrew kept a map pinned to the cabin wall, marked with a location near the state border, a mountainous region. Possibly a clue to the father's hideout? With this new information, Calloway redoubled his efforts, contacting authorities in that mountainous region. Over the next week, they found a small cabin rental in that area under the name A. Carter. A team was dispatched, but by the time they arrived, Andrew was gone again, leaving behind a single threatening note. "I have the ring once I have them. No more running." The words confirmed Andrew knew the ring was found, or at least suspected it. Perhaps the rumor of the ring being in police evidence had reached him. Tension ratcheted up. During this time, Detective Calloway grew more protective of Rebecca and Liam, suspecting Andrew might attempt a direct confrontation. The detective quietly arranged for them to stay at a safe house, but Rebecca insisted on staying at her own apartment. She was tired of hiding. She wanted this to end. Calloway conceded, posting discreet officers near the premises. Days of uneasy calm followed, a sense of foreboding hanging in the air. Then, in the small hours of a chilly night, chaos erupted. A figure was spotted lurking near the building's back entrance. One of the officers shouted for him to stop. A gunshot rang out. Rebecca jolted awake, raced to the window, heart pounding. She saw flashing lights, heard shouting. Another shot. She grabbed Liam, who was shaking with fear, and crouched in the hallway. Moments later, Detective Calloway pounded on her door. "Are you okay?" he asked, breath ragged. She nodded, trembling. "It's Andrew, isn't it?" Calloway confirmed that they believed it was Andrew. He had fled as soon as the officer challenged him. The gunshots were warning shots or possibly an exchange of fire. One officer was grazed, but Andrew escaped into the night. By morning, the entire block was roped off with police tape, and the media was clamoring for statements. Rebecca felt an almost numbing resignation. Andrew was unstoppable in his obsession, and the father was still nowhere to be found. A few days later, Andrew made his move in broad daylight. He cornered Rebecca outside the diner at closing time. She had sent Liam home with Helena, so he wasn't there, thank God. Andrew stepped from behind a dumpster, blocking her path. He looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes, a bruise on his cheek. "Hand over the real ring," he demanded, a noticeable tremor in his voice. "I know you have it. The police can't protect you." She felt the diner's back door at her shoulder blades. No one else was around. She swallowed the panic rising in her chest. "It's in police evidence. I can't give it to you." Andrew snarled, stepping closer. His breath smelled of stale coffee, desperation etched on every feature. "You and your precious detective think you can keep it from me. But I know what's at stake. You have no idea the damage your ex did. He left me with nothing." His voice quavered. "And I'll burn your life to the ground if I have to." She asked in a shaking tone, "Why do you need it so badly?" His response was laced with fury. "Because it's all that's left of my birthright. My father promised it to me. My brother laughed and said I'd never see it. He staged that fire to vanish, probably made money off the insurance. The ring's all I have left." He advanced. She froze, certain he might strike her or drag her away. But suddenly, the roar of an approaching engine echoed through the alley. Headlights flooded them. Andrew cursed, sprinted away before the car could block his path. Rebecca recognized Detective Calloway behind the wheel, relief crashing over her. He jumped out, checking she was unharmed. She sank into his arms, tears flowing. "He's going to kill us if he doesn't get that ring," she sobbed. Calloway supported her, voice steady. "We'll end this. I promise." That night, the detective and his colleagues devised a plan. They would stage a controlled handover of the ring in a public space, hoping to corner Andrew. Rebecca hated the idea. What if Andrew turned violent? But she saw no other solution. Andrew was relentless, and living in constant terror was no longer an option. They chose a busy park at midday, where families with children provided a kind of protective shield. Andrew would be less likely to open fire or try something desperate with so many witnesses. The ring, still in evidence, would be brought in a secured case, along with a team of undercover officers ready to move in. Rebecca would stand at the meeting spot, apparently alone. She insisted Liam stay far away, safe with Helena. The day of the operation dawned cold and bright. Rebecca arrived at the park, wearing a thick coat to hide the bulletproof vest the detective insisted she wear. She felt her stomach churn as she stood near a fountain where children tossed coins. The ring case rested in her purse. She was to display it briefly, then wait for Andrew to approach. Unmarked cars were parked discreetly, and plainclothes officers milled about, pretending to be joggers or dog walkers. Minutes dragged on. Rebecca's heart hammered so loudly she wondered if passers-by could hear it. Then she saw him. Andrew strode across the grass, his posture stiff, eyes scanning every face. He approached with a forced casualness, ignoring the curious stares of families. Rebecca's pulse spiked. She braced herself, slipping a hand into her purse to grasp the ring case. He came within a few feet, face drawn. "Show me," he growled. She lifted the case a fraction, letting him glimpse the antique ring through the small window. His eyes lit with an unholy mix of greed and relief. Before she could signal the officers, Andrew hissed, "I knew you had it. Now you're coming with me." He reached out, grabbing her arm. She gasped, trying to resist, but he tightened his grip. A mother with her toddler nearby looked alarmed, but Andrew flashed a gun under his coat, a silent warning not to intervene. Rebecca glanced around frantically for Calloway. She saw him about 20 yards away, hand at his belt, slipping behind a bench for a vantage. She remembered the plan. Let Andrew lead her out of the immediate crowd if needed, then the officers would move in. Her body tensed, heart hammered, but she forced herself not to scream, hoping to avoid a violent outburst with so many innocent bystanders. Andrew backed away from the fountain, pulling Rebecca along. She kept her expression as neutral as possible, hands still gripping the ring case. Suddenly, a dog barked, startling Andrew. The momentary distraction was enough for her to jerk free from his grasp. She tried to step back, but Andrew swung the gun up, pointing it at her chest. Her eyes widened in terror. People around them screamed or scattered. In the confusion, multiple officers rushed forward, shouting, "Police! Drop your weapon!" Andrew's face contorted with rage. He aimed at one of the approaching plainclothes officers, who dove behind a bench. In that split second, Detective Calloway sprang from the side, tackling Andrew to the ground. Andrew fired once, the shot going wild. Rebecca ducked, heart pounding in her throat. She heard a scuffle of limbs, fists, and the detective shouting for Andrew to drop the gun. Another officer kicked the weapon away. Andrew howled in pain as they wrestled him face down, handcuffing him with swift, practiced movements. It was over in seconds. Yet it felt like a lifetime to Rebecca, who stood trembling near the fountain. Nearby children cried, parents pulled them away. The plainclothes officers flashed badges, urging the crowd to stay calm. Detective Calloway pressed his knee into Andrew's back, breathing heavily, reading him his rights. Andrew spat curses, eyes blazing with fury. "The ring was mine. You can't do this to me. He's alive, you fools." But the officer tightened the cuffs, unmoved by his ranting. Paramedics arrived to check if anyone was hurt. Mercifully, aside from minor bruises, there were no serious injuries. Rebecca sank onto a bench, hugging herself. Her entire body shook in the aftermath of adrenaline. Calloway approached gently once Andrew was secured in a squad car. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I think so." Andrew was hauled away, still screaming about how the father had cheated him. Rebecca watched, a complex swirl of pity and relief flooding her. She realized Andrew was a tormented soul, consumed by bitterness. But that didn't excuse his crimes. The ring had become his obsession, fueling all of his destructive actions. She shuddered, wishing she had never heard of it. In the days that followed, the authorities confirmed Andrew would face multiple charges: kidnapping, assault, attempted murder, among others. The ring would be entered as evidence. The case drew media attention, with sensational headlines about a presumed dead father and a vengeful twin. Detective Calloway privately told Rebecca that he considered the matter mostly resolved, though the question of the father's survival remained open. Officially, the father remained deceased in the records, but the detective suspected he might be out there, possibly reading every newspaper article, aware that Andrew was in custody. Rebecca and Liam tried to move on with their lives. She returned to work at the diner, though her boss gave her flexible hours so she could spend more time at home with her son. Liam resumed school, the whispers about his kidnapping dying down as weeks passed. He still flinched at unexpected noises, but therapy helped. Helena's unwavering friendship provided a safe space where they could unpack their lingering trauma. They leaned on each other, forging an even closer bond. Detective Calloway closed out his final report on the kidnapping case. Over coffee, he explained to Rebecca that Andrew's diaries would be used in court to establish motive. It was clear that Andrew's mania centered around the father's alleged betrayal and the ring. "There's no mention of the father's current whereabouts," Calloway said. "If the father truly is alive, he's done an excellent job staying hidden." Rebecca felt a pang of sadness for Liam, who still occasionally asked if his dad might show up someday. She had no comforting answer. Time edged forward, healing old wounds. The ring, that ancient heirloom, sat locked in an evidence vault. Lawyers debated whether it should go to Andrew's estate, or if the father had rightful claim. But with Andrew awaiting trial, the ring had nowhere to go. Rebecca washed her hands of it, wanting no part of that cursed object. She refocused on giving Liam a stable, loving environment, something she had fought so desperately to preserve. Meanwhile, Detective Calloway moved on to other cases, but he stayed in contact with Rebecca, ensuring they remained safe from any further vendettas. The day Andrew's trial concluded, the verdict was guilty on all major counts. Rebecca sat with Liam in the back row of the courtroom, listening to the judge's stern words. Andrew stared ahead, his shoulders slumped, as though the weight of his obsession finally crushed him. No mention was made of the father's current status. The proceedings focused purely on Andrew's criminal acts. Rebecca felt a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. Another chapter closed, though the father's story remained a mystery. That night, she and Liam shared a quiet dinner. He asked softly, "Do you think Dad knows Andrew's in prison?" She replied, "Possibly. But if your father is alive, I hope he finds peace wherever he is." She tucked Liam into bed, pressing a kiss to his forehead. He drifted off, comforted by her presence. A few weeks later, Detective Calloway brought them the official announcement: Andrew Carter, sentenced to life, no parole for at least 30 years. That hammered home the finality of the matter. Rebecca nodded, tears pricking her eyes, but they were tears of relief this time. She thanked the detective for all he had done. He gave a modest shrug, then left them to their healing. Life began to assume a calm routine. Rebecca and Liam found moments of joy in everyday pleasures: an evening walk, a goofy board game, a trip to the local ice cream parlor. Rebecca still carried the scars of the ordeal. She sometimes startled at shadows. Liam, too, wrestled with nightmares on occasion. But their bond felt unbreakable, forged in adversity. One day, as they strolled by the lake near the old cabin site, Liam pointed to the shimmering water. "I feel free now," he said. She smiled, hugging him close. "Me too." A year passed. The memory of Andrew's malevolent glare faded, overshadowed by the bright, present love they shared. Rebecca occasionally wondered if the father had found out about Andrew's trial. Part of her hoped he saw that justice had been served, and if he was out there, perhaps he no longer felt the need to hide. But the silence continued. On Liam's 12th birthday, she made a small toast. "To new beginnings, baby," she said, raising a plastic cup of sparkling cider. He grinned, clinking cups as Helena cheered. Detective Calloway was invited too, showing up with a simple gift: a detective novel for Liam, who had begun dreaming of maybe becoming a cop to help people someday. After the party ended and Helena left, Rebecca and Liam sat on the couch, looking over the day's photos. Laughter lingered in the corners of their home. Liam rested his head on her shoulder. "Mom, do you think we'll ever see Dad again?" he asked softly. She slipped her arm around him. "I really don't know, sweetheart. But whatever happens, we have each other." He nodded, comforted by her closeness. Late that night, after Liam went to bed, Rebecca tidied up the living room. A knock at the door startled her. She checked the peephole and saw no one, only the faint glow of the hall light. Cautiously, she opened the door. On the floor lay a plain envelope. She picked it up, heart thudding. Inside was a photograph of Liam leaving school, taken from a distance. On the back, a single sentence: "He looks happy." "See." She exhaled shakily. "See for Carter? Or was it someone else? The father?" She peered into the corridor, but no one was there. She had a brief flicker of fear that another threat was emerging. But the note's tone wasn't menacing. It almost sounded pleased. Perhaps the father, if indeed that was who left it, had been watching from afar, ensuring Andrew's threat was removed. She placed the photo in a drawer, deciding not to alarm Liam with it. She would, however, tell Detective Calloway in the morning. For now, the father remained a phantom, silent and distant. She couldn't force him out of the shadows. Her main focus was to cherish the peace that finally settled over her small family. As time drifted on, they carved out a life unburdened by constant fear. Liam excelled in school, forging new friendships. Rebecca took on fewer shifts at the diner, balancing her time so she could be present for her son. She and Helena still shared weekly coffees, gossiping about normal, trivial matters, an incredible relief after the year of terror. Whenever the phone rang late at night, her heart still raced, but typically it was just a coworker or a robocall. Gradually, the adrenaline receded. Sometimes, the ring's memory hovered at the edge of her awareness, knowing it remained locked away, a symbol of betrayal and obsession. She'd glimpsed it once more during Andrew's trial, a piece of evidence sparkling under the courtroom lights. It struck her as so small, so deceptively innocent, for something that had nearly destroyed so many lives. But she refused to let it hold power over her or Liam. It was just an artifact now, severed from their future. On the anniversary of Liam's return, Rebecca took him to the outskirts of the old Carter cabin property, not too close to the ruin, but by the lake's shore. They had a small picnic, feeding ducks and skipping stones. She said it was important to face the place where such a dark chapter had tried to claim them. Liam tossed a rock that skittered across the water's surface. "I don't feel scared here anymore," he said quietly. Rebecca smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. "Me neither. We're stronger than we know." They walked along the water's edge, letting the hush of the lake soothe them. She recalled the day they first found out about the kidnapping, the voicemail that shattered her life. Now, the circle was closed. Andrew was behind bars, and although the father's fate remained uncertain, she was no longer trapped by that uncertainty. She had discovered her own strength, and more importantly, Liam had learned he wasn't alone. Later that evening, as they packed up and headed home, Liam dozed in the passenger seat. The last rays of sunset bathed the trees in gold, and Rebecca felt a calm sense of resolution. Her phone buzzed once with a text from Helena, simply reading, "So proud of you too." She typed back a quick thank you, smiling softly. Yes, ghosts lingered. She occasionally imagined her ex-husband stepping out of a crowd, apologizing for his lies. She imagined Andrew's hateful gaze from behind prison bars. But she refused to let those nightmares own her anymore. By sharing the truth with Liam, by not hiding the painful parts of their history, they found a path forward. Her next plan was to ensure she saved some money for a small vacation. Maybe they'd drive to the beach, let Liam see the ocean for the first time. It was time to replace the memories of fear with ones of wonder. And so, life went on. The final puzzle piece, whether the father might ever reappear, remained unsolved. But not all mysteries need a tidy conclusion. In the hush of a summer dusk, mother and son sat on their apartment balcony, gazing at the stars. Liam said, "Dad missed out on this." She squeezed his hand, nodding. "He did," she whispered. They shared a silent understanding that the love they had now, free from secrets, was enough. That is the story of how a frantic voicemail unraveled a web of lies, how a hidden heirloom stoked a twin's vengeful rage, and how one mother fought relentlessly to protect her child. If you believe that every dark truth deserves its time in the light, please like and subscribe for more stories. Thank you for watching, and remember, no secret can bury love when it's strong enough to stand against the shadows.